What would you do if, in a smoky saloon, a man tossed two human lives into the pot of a poker game, treating them as less than property, a cruel joke played on grief itself? Would you look away, or would you call his bluff? This is the story of Arthur Blackwood, a broken rancher who won twin girls no one wanted, and the first words they spoke made his blood run cold. The frost on the saloon windows fractured the world outside into shards of lantern light and swirling snow, but Arthur Blackwood needed no distortion. His world had been broken long before winter. For a year he had lived as a husk, a widowed rancher haunted by the silence of a dead wife and a daughter who no longer spoke. Now he sat at a battered card table, a full house in his hands, staring at the meaningless promise of victory. The pot itself was pitiful. Scattered coins, wrinkled notes, worthless scraps of pride. But the last stake thrown in by Finch, a man with a viper's smile, was cruel beyond measure. Two Chinese girls, pale as carved jade, no older than 16, sat huddled in the corner, their dark eyes still as frozen lakes. Finch had won them the week before, bought off a ship, and displayed now as if they were curiosities. Their indenture papers lay in the center of the table like an insult sharpened to a blade. What use does a man with no wife and no speaking child have for silence? Finch sneered, his words dripping poison. The men around them laughed, hollow and mean, their mirth echoing against warped timbers and smoke-stained ceilings. Arthur's jaw tightened, not from desire, but from a fury so cold it hollowed his bones. He called the bet. The room fell still when Finch shoved the papers across the table. "They're yours, Blackwood. Enjoy the quiet." Arthur folded the parchment, tucked it into his coat, and rose without a word. Behind him, laughter rattled like bones in a coffin. He did not look at the girls. Not yet. But their presence burned into him like a brand as he stepped into the night wind. The wind outside howled like a mourning hymn as Arthur stepped into the frozen street. The girls followed, their soft-soled shoes leaving no trace on the hard-packed dirt. He had brought a wagon for supplies, but offered them no ride. Some part of him wanted to keep the transaction ugly, to treat them as cargo rather than as children stripped of their freedom. Yet every glance over his shoulder showed two figures walking in lockstep, their bearing strangely regal despite the cold that burned their lips blue. The journey stretched long across skeletal woods and open plains. Branches clawed at a gunmetal sky while the land itself seemed to whisper of death. Arthur rode in silence, his coat drawn tight, his heart clenched tighter. Each crunch of their steps behind him was a reminder of what Finch had forced into his hands. When the ranch finally rose against the bruised horizon, it was less a home than a tomb. Smoke no longer curled from the chimney. Light no longer warmed the windows. It stood like a monument to grief, every board steeped in the memory of Sarah, his wife. He dismounted, leather creaking in the stillness, and turned at last to face them. Frost clung to their lashes, but their eyes, dark, unwavering, did not falter. For a moment, Arthur saw not property, but two children fighting to appear unbroken. Inside, he rasped, his voice brittle as rusted iron. They stepped past him, shadows merging with the greater shadow of the house. Dust lay thick upon every surface, a child's doll lay abandoned by the hearth, and the air smelled of cold ash. This was the shrine he had built to sorrow, and he had just invited strangers into its heart. The twins stood quietly near the door, their gazes sweeping the desolation with unnerving precision, as though they were cataloging each fracture of his soul. Arthur lit a lantern, its sudden glow casting long, skeletal shadows. He pointed toward a narrow storage room with a cot. One word, grunted like dismissal. There. He turned away, ready to retreat into solitude. But then he heard it soft, steady, rhythmic. Sweeping. One girl had taken a broom and was clearing a path through the dust. The other worked the kitchen pump, water clanking into the silence. Without orders, they had begun to mend the ruin he had allowed. Arthur stood rooted, the broom's scratch and the pump's clank echoing like fragile defiance against years of decay. He expected them to collapse in weariness or cower under his stare. Instead, they moved with quiet precision, a rhythm born of survival. One gathered kindling for the fireplace, the other scrubbed grime from the stovetop until the iron shone. From the pantry, they unearthed a few withered potatoes, half a sack of flour, and before long the scent of cooking drifted through the hollow house. It was a smell he had not known in a year, smoke mingling with broth, faint and familiar, like a ghost's embrace. Against his will, warmth seeped into the cracks of his chest. He retreated to his chair by the hearth, watching as they worked. Their presence was relentless yet unassuming, pushing back against the tide of neglect he had surrendered to. Then, from the shadows, another figure emerged, Lily. His 6-year-old daughter drifted barefoot across the wooden floor, a whisper of a child with solemn eyes. She had not spoken a word since Sarah's death. Her silence was a blade that cut deeper than any grief. She lingered in the doorway, thumb in her mouth, watching the twins with a ghost stillness. But the girls did not startle her. They acknowledged her presence with a slight nod, a fleeting glance, nothing more. They folded her nightgown neatly at the foot of her bed, left bowls of warm porridge on the table, and returned to their work. They seemed to understand Lily in a way no one else could. Through silence, through patience, through small acts of care. Arthur's heart ached with every moment. He wanted to bridge the gulf between himself and his child, but words turned to stone on his tongue. Then, one afternoon, a fragile thread formed. Lily carried in her tiny hand a wooden bird, his last clumsy gift to Sarah, now her talisman. It slipped and skittered across the floor, landing at Mai's feet. Arthur braced for Lily's panic, the usual recoil into shadow, but Mai only lifted the bird gently, tracing its rough wings with delicate fingers. She knelt and offered it back with no pity, only quiet recognition of its importance. Lily froze, then darted forward to snatch it back. Yet that day she lingered closer, her curiosity beginning to outweigh her fear. The days that followed carried a strange transformation. The house, once entombed in dust and silence, began to breathe again. Warmth from the hearth returned. The sharp scent of ginger and simmering broth filled the air, and for the first time since Sarah's passing, the rooms echoed with movement instead of despair. One evening, Lily edged closer to the kitchen table where Leanne kneaded dough with strong, rhythmic hands. On the mantel above, Sarah's photograph smiled down in silver frame, her eyes bright with a light that grief had long extinguished. Lily stared at the picture, then at Leanne, then back again. Her lips trembled, opening like a door rusted shut. A sound broke free, small, cracked, almost unreal. Arthur froze in his chair, his ledger slipping unnoticed to the floor. Lily lifted a trembling finger toward the photograph, her face strained with effort, as if clawing through walls of silence. Finally, a whisper emerged, brittle as spun glass. "Mama?" The room itself seemed to pause. The twins halted mid-motion, their dark eyes luminous with sorrow and patience. Leanne stepped forward, wiping flour from her hands, and knelt before Lily. She didn't touch her, she simply followed her gaze to the photograph. Her voice, clear and soft, cut the silence. "Mama?" Arthur's breath hitched. The word, echoed now by a stranger, felt like both a wound and a benediction. Then Mai, standing near the hearth, turned her gaze, not to the photograph, but to Arthur himself. Her lips parted, her voice no louder than falling snow. Sad. The word struck like a bullet. It named what had poisoned this house for a year, the grief choking him, the silence suffocating Lily. In 2 syllables, the twins had spoken the truth. No neighbor, no preacher, no friend had dared to. Arthur went pale, as though the very walls of his sorrow had been ripped open. The cruel joke Finch had played at the card table now revealed itself as something else entirely. These girls were not burdens. They were mirrors, healers, silent prophets who could pierce the armor of despair with a single word. For the first time in a year, Arthur felt his heart lurch not toward death, but toward the fragile spark of life returning. The night after Lily's first whisper, the sky itself seemed to tremble. Snow began to fall in thick, suffocating sheets, erasing the horizon and swallowing the plains in a storm that howled like a furious ghost. Within hours, the ranch was sealed in white silence, the windows crusted with frost, the doors groaning under drifts of snow. For 3 days, they were captives of the blizzard, The wind clawed at the walls, shrieking like some spirit intent on dragging them into the void. Arthur, stubborn rancher that he was, went out to check the livestock as the storm deepened. The cold struck him like a predator, biting his breath, searing his lungs, blinding his eyes with shards of ice. He staggered back into the cabin, half frozen, collapsing before the hearth with a cough that rattled his bones. Fever consumed him. The world dissolved into a haze of fire and shadows. Yet through the delirium he felt gentle hands pressing broth to his lips, cool cloths against his brow, voices murmuring not in English but in a flowing, melodic tongue that eased his pain. In his fever dreams he saw Sarah. He reached for her, whispering her name, and those hands did not correct him. They only held his trembling fingers until sleep dragged him under again. Leanne and Mai moved with uncanny precision, one tending to Arthur while the other kept Lily warm and fed. They brewed teas from herbs found in the pantry, yarrow, mullein, sharp remedies their ancestors must have carried across oceans. They worked tirelessly, not as servants, but as guardians standing watch over a house on the edge of ruin. Arthur, trapped in fever, spilled confessions he had never dared speak aloud. He spoke of Sarah, of their first meeting, of promises unkept, of the crushing guilt that her death had carved into his heart. And the twins listened, their silence a vessel into which he poured his poison, their eyes reflecting not judgment but a depth of compassion that stripped him bare. On the fourth morning the storm relented. Light seeped through the frost like milk through muslin, and the ranch exhaled. Arthur woke in his own bed, scorched clean by fever, weak but present. The air smelled of cedar smoke and sharp herb tea. From the main room came the soft susurrus of voices and the scratch of charcoal on wood. He steadied himself on the doorframe and looked in. Lily sat cross-legged on the floor, tongue peeking at the corner of her mouth as she drew careful lines on a scrapboard. Beside her, Mai guided her hand, slow strokes, patient pauses, while Leanne watched the white world beyond the window, measuring the day with a sentinel's calm. They were not possessions. They were the pulse inside his house. Gratitude hit him with the ache of a healed bone. He remembered cool hands on fire, whispered lullabies in a language like water over stones, and the quiet courage with which they had held his world together. "Thank you," he rasped. Leanne dipped her head. Mai offered a hesitant smile. Lily lifted her board, a single character dark and sure. "Flower," she said, proud as dawn. Something old and iron inside Arthur let go. He reached for the ledger that had fallen days before and closed it with finality, as though sealing a grave. "I owe you more than breath," he said. "I owe you your names, your freedom, and a home that answers to both." The words surprised him with their steadiness. He had spoken vows once beneath a church roof. Now he spoke another beneath his own. He found their papers where he had hidden them and fed a sliver to the fire, just the corner, just enough to feel the glow of choice. "Leanne, Mai," he said slowly, as if christening the room with truth. "No one takes you from this door without stepping over me." The promise was not thunder. It was bedrock, settling quiet, immovable, true. By afternoon, the snow broke into bright, wet silence. Eaves dripped like ticking clocks, and the fields lay white and humbled. Arthur rose, dressed, and stepped onto the porch to taste the cold. The storm had scoured the world to first truths: wood, breath, vow. Behind him the house breathed steadily, kettle whispering, Lily humming a tune she scarcely remembered knowing, Mai checking the fire, Leanne folding clean linens with a chapel's reverence. He went to the workbench and took up his knife. From a strip of pine he carved two slim plaques, careful cuts, patient curls, the blade speaking in soft, honest syllables. When he finished, he burned each name into the grain, L-N-E-I. The letters darkened, smoke rising in thin blue prayers. He hung one over the small room off the kitchen, the other above the porch door, so all who crossed his threshold would read them and understand. Lily came to stand beside him, her hand warm and sure around two of his fingers. "Home," she whispered, as if testing a bridge newly built across deep water. The words settled into Arthur like a key turning. He felt the house answer, floorboards easing, timbers loosening their long-held sigh. He fetched the indenture papers, spread them on the table, and read every line. When he was done, he set a nail through the bundle and tapped it into the beam above the hearth. Not burned, not hidden, kept where the fire's light could touch it, a witness to what had been survived and what would not be repeated. These do not own you, he said. My word does, and it frees. Dusk came thin and pewter. On the ridge, 3 silhouettes materialized against the bleached sky, horse and rider cut from iron, Finch in the lead posture, lazy, eyes mean. The old world was riding down to reclaim its claim. Arthur rested his palm on the doorframe, felt the grain, felt the vow, and knew the turning was complete. Whatever crossed his yard now would meet a man, not a ghost. The riders reined up by the fence, hooves churning slush into mud. Finch leaned forward in his saddle, his smirk brittle against the gray sky. Well, Blackwood, he drawled, spitting dark juice into the snow, seems you've put your winnings to work, but we've come to take them off your hands. My friend here's offering double. His companions chuckled thinly, their laughter shriveled by the cold. Arthur stepped onto the porch, rifle loose in his hands. He did not raise it yet. The weight of steel was less weapon than covenant, an unspoken line between past and present. He looked at Finch and felt no tremor, only clarity. They're not for sale. Finch's grin faltered. A man doesn't get to decide that. Papers say otherwise. Indentures a deed, just like land. He reached into his coat as though to draw proof, but Arthur's voice cut through the air, steady and cold. Their names are Leanne and Mai. The words hung heavy as church bells. He had spoken them before inside the house, but now he carved them into the open air, binding them in truth before God and neighbor alike. They are under my roof and my protection. They are family. The declaration stunned the riders. Even the horses shifted uneasily. Finch narrowed his eyes, searching for the broken drunk he had once mocked, but that man was gone. In his place stood a figure rooted in grief and tempered by storm, a man who had buried a wife, nearly lost a child, and been given back both courage and kin. Family? Finch spat the word like a curse. They ain't your kind. Arthur took one step forward, the rifle still lowered. They are the kind who mend what others break, the kind who face storms without flinching, the kind who gave my daughter her voice back. That makes them my kind. For a long breath, the plain itself seemed to wait. Snow melted in slow rivulets, dripping from the eaves like a ticking clock. Then Finch swore, yanked his reins, and wheeled his horse. His men followed, their bravado trailing behind them like smoke from a dying fire. Arthur did not lower the rifle until they were specks on the horizon. Only then did he turn. The door had creaked open. Leanne and Mai stood in its frame, eyes shining with something he had never seen directed at him before, trust. Behind them, Lily clutched Mai's sleeve, watching with solemn pride. They had heard everything. Days unfurled in a gentler cadence. The ranch woke before sun, not from habit alone, but from purpose. Arthur repaired the north fence line, planed new boards smooth as river stones, and set posts straight as prayer. In the kitchen, bread rose beneath a cloth while a simmering pot traded its steam with the winter air. The house, once a tomb, learned to breathe. Lily's laughter returned first, bright and surprising as a meadowlark. She raced the thaw through the yard, pockets full of small treasures, buttons, acorns, a marble she swore held a storm. At night she chattered in a braid of English, and the careful Chinese the twins taught her, syllables flowering where silence had once taken root. Arthur listened the way a man listens to rain after drought. He learned, too, the quiet language of this new household. The pinch at Leanne's brow meant the well ran low. The soft exhale from Mai meant the bread had risen just right. He answered in wood and labor. He built 2 proper beds for the small room off the kitchen, rubbed the pine with oil until it shone like honey, and stitched mattresses with horsehair and ticking. On his next trip to town, he bought bolts of blue calico and needles fine as whiskers. He said little at the counter, but when the shopkeeper raised an eyebrow and asked, "Your girls?" Arthur answered, my family. The iron hush that followed said the town had heard him. They rode home, seated beside him on the wagon, not hidden in back. Finch and his men loitered near the general store that day, faces soured by thwarted greed. Arthur let his gaze pass through them like through smoke. He introduced the sisters simply Leanne, Mai, leaving no room for speculation, only for names. Twilight found Leanne on the porch with a small carved flute Arthur had never seen. She lifted it to her lips and released a song that traveled the yard like river light, part longing, part arrival. He sat beside her, hands quiet, heart listening. Mai hummed from the kitchen, Lily drew spirals at their feet, and the night took their sound and made a covenant of it. We remain, we mend, we grow. Spring crept across the plains in hesitant strokes. Snow receded into rivulets. The earth turned to dark loam, and shoots of grass pierced the thawing mud. Arthur rose each morning with the sun, no longer to perform duties of habit, but to build a life worth sharing. The rhythm of the ranch was steadier now, carried by 4 hearts that beat in quiet harmony. Leanne and Mai carried their past like locked boxes, but sometimes a shadow leaked through. A flinch at raised voices in town, a fleeting glance between them when a stranger stared too long. Arthur did not press. He had learned that silence could be sanctuary as well as cage. Instead, he offered shield and steadiness. At the mercantile, when whispers coiled behind hands, he met eyes until they dropped. On the road, when Finch's cronies muttered, he placed the sisters in the wagon seat beside him, tall and unashamed. Lily became their fiercest herald. Once, when a shopkeeper's son jeered, calling them names meant to sting, the little girl planted her hands on her hips and declared, "They are my family, and they are beautiful." The boy's grin withered. Arthur, watching, felt pride surge like a tide. This child, who had once spoken only in silence, now defended love with a lion's heart. Back at the ranch, the days layered themselves with simple abundance. The scent of wild sage Mai planted by the door. The sound of Lily's voice weaving Chinese lullabies into her play. The sight of Arthur's own hands shaping fences, mending roofs, carving toys he once thought he'd never make again. The poker table where this cruel story had begun seemed a ghost from another man's life. He had entered the saloon a hollow widower and left it with 2 fragile souls, mocked as property. Yet those souls had nursed his fever, stirred his daughter's voice from the grave of grief, and called him back to life. He no longer measured time by loss, but by presence, by bread rising, by flute music drifting, by laughter under open sky. And though the West was still a harsh land, the ranch now bore its own weather, not storms, but seasons of healing. The cruelest hands of fate often shuffle their cards in smoke-choked rooms, with laughter as hollow as the promises wagered there. Finch believed he had written the end of Arthur Blackwood when he tossed 2 children into the pot like scraps of meat. But destiny has a way of dressing itself in rags, arriving as burdens that prove to be blessings. What began as a joke at another man's expense became the saving of a house, a family, and a soul. Arthur discovered that silence is not always absence. In the stillness of Leanne's bowed head and Mai's gentle hands, he found languages deeper than words. Through their patience, the house that had been a shrine to sorrow began to pulse again with breath and firelight. They did not conquer his grief with speeches or sermons. They named it quietly with a simple courage of truth. Sad. That single word lifted the veil from his heart and forced him to look at what he had tried to bury. And in Lily, the child who had lived 1 full year without a voice, he witnessed the miracle of compassion. She spoke again, not because she was commanded, but because she was welcomed into a circle of tenderness. From her mouth, first a whisper, then a declaration, flowed the promise that grief need not be a prison forever. The girl who had lost her mother found sisters who stitched her world back together with needle, rice, and lullaby. The lesson is older than the West itself. Blood alone does not define family. Family is forged in fire, in storm, in nights when fever threatens to carry a man away and hands not bound by law keep him tethered to life. It is found in small choices, setting an extra bowl at the table, speaking a name aloud, defending the dignity of another when silence would be safer. Arthur learned that love does not arrive as a thunderclap. It enters as a steady flame carried in the cupped palms of those who endure. When the storm broke, when the riders left in defeat, what remained was not merely survival but transformation. A ranch, once branded by grief, had become a sanctuary of belonging. So if the West teaches anything, it is this: men are not measured by the hands they are dealt, but by how they choose to play them. Arthur was dealt silence, death, and cruelty. He answered with recognition, with protection, and with the audacity to call strangers kin. And in that choice lay redemption, not just for him, but for every heart under his roof.